Hi, everyone. Welcome this morning. I'm Rich Calhoun. I worked with Gabe Perkins and Inland Woods and Trails and Trust for Public Land, amongst others, to help create the Rumford Community Forest over the past couple years. That work was inspired in no small part by the book, The Great Displacement, by this morning's first speaker. Jake Bittle is an author and journalist. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, and he's currently a staff writer at Grist. His work in the climate space intersects with our work here today in the overlap in the insurance industry, planning, development, and how we see the future of our communities in a changing environment. So I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Jake Bittle.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me, and I too am pleased that it's not raining. When I heard that it rains every year here, well, it didn't make me question my decision to come, but it's always nice when it's sunny. So it's really neat to be here, for two reasons. The first is that my grandparents' family are from Nova Scotia, so I feel a little connection to Maine. I mean, everyone from New York City loves Maine, but I feel an extra connection to Maine because of the Bay of Fundy, and I think probably the first interest that I had in the environment was watching the immense tidal range and the tidal flats in the Bay of Fundy, so that's neat. The second reason, though, is that when I first started working on the book, I tried to talk to people who were involved in climate change and climate activism and academics about what was going on with climate change and housing displacement in the United States, and I quickly found that none of them knew really anything about what was happening, at the local level as a result of climate disasters. And the people that I spoke to who did know were, almost entirely urban planners, local government officials, developers, insurance agents, mortgage originators, and of course, just people who lived in those communities. So I'm excited to hear you all talk and learn from you, because almost all the information of value in the book came from people doing work like yourselves. And I think whether climate is present in day-to-day conversations or not, your work tends to be some of the first work that gets affected by those disasters, as you probably already know. So I'll start by just talking a little bit about the sort of status quo of climate change and housing displacement in the U.S., and then I'll talk a little about what it might mean for Maine over the next lifetime or two. So basically right now in the U.S. there's risk and there's risk, right? So in many places across the country, including here, like Vermont got it last year, there's immense potential for flooding and other sort of like rapid fire disasters that are very hard to predict, right? Like we all have seen development decisions really close to the floodplain, or storms that unleash a large amount of precipitation. There's really bad windstorms, hailstorms, et cetera. And these are getting worse. The insurance companies are freaking out. Insurance rates in almost every part of the country are going up. However, there are parts of the country, not here, where this risk is like basically existential, right? So in the book, I went to Eastern North Carolina, Houston, Santa Rosa, California. These are places where basically every year, thousands of people are losing their homes as a result of climate disasters. Insurance it's extremely unaffordable, to the point that mortgage originators don't want to touch a lot of these areas. And while many people make it back after they lose their homes in a fire or something, a lot of people don't, right? And so that's for two reasons, right? One is that they have a psychological decision, right? Like, I don't want to go back there again. Or FEMA and HUD, the federal agencies that do disaster prevention, they just don't have enough money, wherewithal, or frankly expertise to rebuild a community that's been hit by these disasters. So you have like a constant churn of low-level displacement, and then you have a big event like Hurricane Ian or the 2017 wine country fires that totally alters the trajectory of a community like that. So that was the principal thing that I started the book with, because it was right in front of me. But I think the natural question that I wanted to answer was like, where is everyone going, right? So it's a surprisingly difficult question to answer, and the answer turns out to be, at least right now, like they're not going very far from the places that they're displaced from, right? So they'll end up like right down the road from the flooded home, or they'll go to like the next town over if they get burned on a wildfire. And there's very, very little, comprehensive data on this, which is one reason why I don't have a slideshow. But, FEMA like maintains a database of like 40,000 home buyouts. This is like, in addition to the unmanaged sort of dislocation from these places, also FEMA has a program where they'll give a state or a locality money to buy out a repetitively flooded home, and that person goes somewhere else. So in Houston, like I called like 1,000 people on this list who had taken buyouts. Most of the phone numbers were disconnected, but and I did like a little unscientific study of where they went, and most people went like maybe 5 miles away, right? So they wanted to maintain their existing social networks, obviously. Maybe they had a job, maybe their kids were in school, which all really makes sense. But furthermore, I think people just had like an affinity for the region that they were from, and they didn't immediately want to just uproot and leave and go to a completely different part of the country, right? So that creates this kind of bizarre, almost like cauldron effect, where every year, people get displaced over and over again. They'll move 5 or 6 times, they'll move away, they'll come back. And that was like the, sort of like the ground level of displacement as described in the book. But I think like the question that I ended with, and what I get asked a lot, is like, well, on a long-term trajectory, like what does this mean for the rest of the country? There's a lot of places in the country, including here, that they don't face that existential level of risk from climate change, and what does this mean for them? And it's a really, really difficult question. I'm going to try to answer it. So sort of 2 things, right? One is that you start to see, like, in demographic projections over the next couple decades, and just in sort of movement patterns from, especially after COVID, a few regional migration trends that are really interesting, right? Like one is that after the 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise, California, a lot of people moved to Boise, Idaho, they moved to Austin, and they moved to Bozeman. And part of the reason for this was actually like political self-sorting. Like that's a very conservative part of the state, and people wanted to go to a place that wasn't governed by Gavin Newsom, but also there was like an economic leverage piece, right? Where a home even in the most remote part of the northern woods in California is like upwards of $1.5 million. And if you go to Boise, where D.R. Horton is building like 1,000 homes a day, you can basically get whatever you want, right? So like a lot of people showed up, and if you had a California plate in Boise, like, you could get like tomatoes thrown at you while you were leaving the supermarket parking lot. Like it was that bad. And so another thing though, like after hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, a lot of people tended to go to kind of the next closest major city that wasn't on the coast, right? So you saw it after Katrina, famously, like a lot of people from New Orleans ended up in Houston after they stayed in the Superdome. And there was a similar thing, like if you had a 504 area code, like you couldn't get a call back for a job application for like 10 years. And then also, if you can definitely sit. I don't know if you guys are waiting to, the people who are like getting their bat, you should come up and sit. I'm not gonna mind. And then, but like now recently after like, there was a hurricane in 2017 in Florida, there was one in 2020 in Lake Charles, Louisiana. You see a lot of people show up in the school districts in Dallas, Orlando, basically places where, they wanna go to the next safest but still close cities. So those cities, obviously like Orlando can get hit by hurricanes, but it's not on the coast, so it doesn't face like existential hurricane risk. So that's what we see like over the next decade or so. There's a few demographers who have sort of concluded that Atlanta, Dallas, Orlando, they're likely to see the biggest benefits of near-term climate migration. And it helps that these are cities that are also growing a lot for other reasons, right? Like people like the sun. There's been a ton of investment in electric vehicles in a lot of these places because of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a bunch of sort of like coincident things that are leading to those sort of like a new sun belt kind of. But in addition to that, like when I was writing the book, I got so many emails from people who, this is, again, it's unscientific, but so many emails from people who were saying like, I don't like living through the smoke in San Francisco. I'm going to Connecticut. I'm going to Maine. I'm going to Vermont. And among relatively well-off people, there are a lot of people who make an elective decision to, and these are people who tend to be psychologically, I think, they're the most concerned about climate change, and they have the most pessimistic view of it. They tend to go, okay, well, we can go anywhere, we work remotely, et cetera. Maybe it's time to retire. Like, we're gonna go to the most resilient place. And furthermore, I mean, that's anecdotal, but if you look at like Redfin and Zillow have done surveys of U.S. home buyers, and more of them now, far more. I mean, if you look at the list of the rate of people in the United States who say climate change is a top political issue for them, that's gone up from 20% to 30% in the last 25 years or something. But if you look at the share of U.S. home buyers in these studies who say that climate change is factoring in where they look to buy a home, it's gone up quite a bit more and much, much faster, right? So now you see 50% of home buyers say to Redfin, we're really concerned about fires and flooding when we look for a home. Now, that doesn't seem to be stopping them from moving to Florida, Texas, and Arizona. I mean, if you look at the census flows, it's not there yet, but it's very, I think, profound thing. And I think as more disasters happen, public opinion of these places, especially those that are vulnerable to chronic heat, like Phoenix had 31 days of 110-degree temperatures or something last year, more of them will say, okay, we need to go somewhere else. And there's been a few places that have tried to, I think rather prematurely, tried to take advantage of this eventual fact that, if you look at a century-long time scale, and you're really concerned about water availability, vulnerability to extreme heat, vulnerability to large disasters like hurricanes and wildfires, there's a band of the country which has been losing population for quite some time, which now looks a lot better than it once did. And so there's a few interesting examples of cities, relatively large cities, that have tried to, if you will, weaponize or take opportunity from this idea of being a climate haven or a climate refuge. I think probably the most famous one is there's this guy at Harvard named Jesse Keenan who created this almost pitch for the city of Duluth, Minnesota, as climate-proof Duluth. And he, I mean, well, and you go, and I haven't done this because so many other people have done it, but CNN, et cetera, they send reporters to Duluth, right? And they say we read about this thing from this guy at Harvard, what do you guys think of it? And the mayor, of course, is we would love that. I mean, Duluth has room for more people than are currently there. But you ask anybody else, and they say oh God, don't publish that, don't tell people that, and of course and they also say that's never gonna happen, it's too cold, right? And there's something to that right now, right? I just don't think, although CNN managed to find people from California who relocated to Duluth, and you can tell in the interview that they did, they're not without regret, but it just sort of indicates, I think, that we're in a very transitional stage when it comes to even elective movement from vulnerable areas to areas that are considered to be relatively resilient to climate change, right? And so while in theory, Duluth and Buffalo did this too, and Cincinnati, which was, built to house more than twice as many people as it currently does. And if you go to Cincinnati, you can see they're not in very good condition, but there are tens of thousands of housing units that are just sitting empty, basically. I mean, they need a little bit of TLC, but if a bunch of people were to show up tomorrow and the federal government was to say, hey, here's some money they could put them all in houses eventually, right? So now, I was reading before I got here. I was reading this essay by Thoreau called Katahdin, where he tried to climb Mount Katahdin, and he failed because there was like too much fog, but and he like went back down. But he says about Maine, he says, "We have advanced by leaps to the Pacific and left many a lesser Oregon and California unexplored behind us." So he has this like idea that even in the 1840s, that we're going too far, we're like expanding way too far out into the rest of the world, or the United States, that is, and we're leaving behind like so much opportunity for development, like in good old Maine. And I think like, sometimes when I would hear from people like, do you think that climate change could lead to, like, I thought of this because even at the time, right, this was 46, I think he wrote this, the gold rush hadn't even happened yet, he was perceiving very clearly that there were strong economic pull factors that were leading people all the way over the Rocky Mountains to California, like to Sutter's Mill for gold, et cetera. And those factors weren't inducing the same degree of development in Maine, which still like has like, I think it's like 90% of the land in Maine is forested, which like on the global scale, like only like Amazon countries have like that degree of, like Suriname has like 95%. And so he was saying like we aren't developing this, like why basically, and I'm gonna flip the page, which is gonna take a second. So like I think it's, if you look at the way that development happens in the United States, or like the reason for places beginning to grow, you'll see that it almost always seems to have to do with either a very targeted public investment or a rather resource-driven or like somewhat coincidental sometimes like arrival of private industry, right? So I think like for you guys, like there's a really, there's two questions about this eventual migration of people to Maine, right? If you look at like a 2100 scale, eventually, this is a great place to live for climate reasons, right? Like yes, it's vulnerable to flooding, but everywhere is. It's inland, there's abundant fresh water. Heat waves can happen anywhere, but they're probably gonna be far less frequent here. So like how do we induce like migration to this place, and also like how do we prepare for it, right? And like to take those two questions in turn, like what I was sort of trying to start saying before is like, it's not clear that a local or a state government can like ride the negative perception of like southern and coastal places to induce like development or new investment like in its own communities. Like after the recession, as you guys probably know, like West Virginia, like Detroit, like they have rather generous relocation stipends. Those are places that are relatively resilient to climate change as well. But those policies don't seem to foster like anything like the kind of economic growth that can turn around a place that's like lost a lot of population or is economically depressed, right? So that's one thing, right? It seems like even with climate change creating like a significant push factor that alters public perceptions, it's still going to take some kind of seed investment from like a private company to like look at Austin, for instance, right? Like Austin was kind of languishing for decades, and then Elon Musk and a bunch of people said like, we'll put our stuff here, and now if you go there, like it's astonishing, like in 3 years they have far more skyscrapers than anyone there ever wanted. But it took some kind of endogenous, like someone had to come in and say like, I'm putting a lot of money in here. And then you get a traditional cycle of like housing costs increasing, like new people coming in, incumbent renters and homeowners feeling very, very squeezed. And then of course tension, like was in Boise, like has happened in some parts of Dallas since the hurricanes, it happened in Houston. And it's really, really, really difficult to figure out how to get out of that cycle. And I think like, despite the fact that the current administration in the federal government is like really aware of climate change, has tried to act on it, it's really hard to see the federal government right now making a coherent effort to channel investment and development like interest toward less vulnerable places, right? Like I just don't think, we don't have like a federal climate adaptation or a climate relocation strategy in the United States. Like all FEMA has done is give out basically competitive grants to cities and states that want to fix local issues, and they've accidentally kind of spurred climate migration by doing that. But it's hard to imagine a situation where the government like really picks losers and winners in that way, right? Like DOE and EPA may give out huge grants for, new hydrogen or whatever projects, and they did it in the Ohio River Valley and they've done it in the Central Valley of California. But they're not gonna say like, we're gonna incentivize people to move here and not there, because that's just like a political loser for obvious reasons, especially when the electoral college like depends on Arizona basically now and Georgia, right? So it's hard to imagine that happening. And so in the absence of something like that, you probably see companies, especially white collar businesses, that we've seen a little bit of this, like they may want to, if they're a startup or something, they may, respond to the sentiments of their young mobile employees by wanting to, put down roots in a place that right now is relatively resilient to climate change, or that doesn't have the like really negative push factors that like Tampa Bay, where I'm from, or like Arizona has, right? So that's still a couple of decades away. But you could imagine it happening, and it seems like the first potential like route to that happening would be like if a private company were to spur the kind of growth that now is like very difficult for some small communities to handle. So like I'm not an urban planner. I've never tried to manage a town. I don't think I'd be very good at it if I tried. But like, you guys are laughing like, yeah, we can tell. I think like there's a few principles that are going to matter a lot, like a few principles of urban planning and urban design and just housing policy that are going to matter a lot. Like, I think a lot of the growth that will eventually come to a place like Maine is going to happen. It's going to be routed through like, a town has to deal with a proposition for investment by like New Balance or something. Like New Balance wants to bring a bunch of people here, or let's say it's like some data center or something, and we know they're going to be high-paying jobs. The town is going to have to, like deal with like, okay, where's the water permit? Like, where's the water coming from, right? Where are these people going to live? Should we approve that new development down the road? How much affordable housing should we try to extract from the developer in order to give them a condition of approval, right? Like, those are the questions that, at the local level are they're the same questions that everyone's facing now, but I think like you're gonna see the kind of like color of climate change in them in the next couple decades. And now, like, that doesn't necessarily change the answer though. Like, I think, that we've had a debate in this country for years about like, at basically every community in the country about like, how much growth is too much, like what's the right, conditions for approving new housing, like, what kind of impact fee do we need to demand from like a private business or something. And, like from my perspective, I think like, those answers, like, I feel like density is better for the climate, like from an emissions standpoint. It also seems to be better from an adaptation standpoint, because a lot of the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change are the ones that Horton built, like, and like Lennar, like in Houston, like you can watch them do this. Like they basically roll out a carpet of homes, like across like dozens of different bayous and rivers and stuff. And then all of a sudden, 2 decades later, like the water comes down and everyone's like, what the, like, come on, like you never told us, right? That, and Horton basically knew about, anyway. The point is, like, if you build up rather than out, and you are very careful about where you build, you can be a little more selective about the kind of, about the environments in which you build. And so, I mean, it's very easy for me to say, like, it's good to have dense housing, right? Because like those, battles get fought, like it's like street fighting, right? Like those get fought at the town council and among like sometimes like, single-digit hundreds or dozens of people. And like, it's not for me to say, I think, like, to people in local government, like, this is how you should do it, because it's not an easy job. But I think, like, if you really look at the demographic projections, how much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay, that's good. If you look at the demographic projections, at some point, right, there's going to be some kind of influx of people, and it's really hard to say exactly where. But if Maine remains, like, hypothetically a good place to go, from a climate resilience standpoint, eventually there will be private businesses that, like I was talking with Rich before about the Brookfield Dam, like there's a lot of really, really relatively reliable hydropower here, it's zero emissions. Like that's hard to come by in a lot of places. Like in Arizona, when they're looking to site data centers, like this is a huge issue. Like no like green conscious company wants to have to go through the permitting process for building a giant solar farm, right? B, like have to get gas power from the Salt River project. Like people like access to green power, they like access to like amenities for their employees, et cetera, et cetera. That will happen eventually, right? And eventually the like questions of density and where to build and how to build and how much to build are going to become, I think, more acute for like people who are already dealing with them. It's just really hard to say exactly when and exactly where. But you know, to complicate this question, there's another quote from Thoreau. It's actually a really funny essay if you go back and read it, because he didn't really know how to climb mountains, and so you can tell the guide is like, don't do that, you know, and he climbs into this crevice and like actually almost gets eaten by a bear. So he describes Maine after getting down from the mountain. He says, "Here was no man's garden, but the unhandselled globe. It was not lawn, nor pasture, nor mead, nor woodland, nor arable, nor wasteland. It was the fresh and natural surface of the planet Earth, as it was made forever and ever to be the dwelling of man. So nature made it, and man may use it if he can." So this is, I think, like, with respect to Thoreau, like, this is, you know, and I think we can see echoes of this, like, in the current conversation about, you know, potential migration to a place like Maine. Like, these are economically depressed communities in many cases. They could house more people than they do, and we want growth, right? Like, we want to attract, and you can almost hear it in what he's saying, but it's kind of a dangerous notion in some ways, right? Like, the natural resources, like what in private industry they now call ecosystem services, of this place are like extraordinary. They have like a sort of illimitable value, and they should be like protected and stewarded. And I think the task that you all probably face is how to walk the line between, you know, trying to grab some of the prosperity that may, you know, come here as people selectively over time trickle away from the most vulnerable places, and how to grow in a way that doesn't compromise the like really, really great sort of inheritance that you have of like an astonishingly beautiful place that, you know, since Thoreau has like still been relatively undeveloped for like reasons both of choice and practicality. So I think, like, you know, there's a bunch of ways to do that, right? And I think, you know, part of the preparation for an eventual climate migration may look like, you know, resolving the incumbent climate issues in Maine, right? So there's the active debates here don't have to do really with climate migration, right? There's like energy questions like NECEC, the you know, potential public takeover of CMP, which I understand was voted down. And then there's questions about development, like a lot of housing is really prone to flooding. I think like there's an element of like getting one's own house in order here that has a co-benefit for a future migration, right? Like if you can grab these BRIC and HMGP grants from FEMA to like fix stormwater systems and like buy out really flood-prone homes. These are very competitive, but FEMA has like technical assistance now for smaller communities. If you can do that, like if you can decarbonize the power grid and make sure that power is reliable, you lay a good foundation, I think, for future arrivals, right? And you create a pattern of development and growth that could be replicated, you know, ad infinitum or like to a much larger extent when there's like a big surge of people, if there ever is. So that's a difficult line to walk, I think. I think, like, you know, you guys are very smart and you're more than capable of doing it probably, like, and it's just very, very hard. I wouldn't want to try to do it, but like there's a dual mandate here as you think about a lot of people coming to Maine of like, we have to grow, like it's good to grow because there's people who need help and we need money to help them, but also like how can we grow in a way that, you know, doesn't compromise the things that frankly are going to attract people, which is like, it's an immensely beautiful natural ecosystem, it's relatively undisturbed and unpolluted, and it's really resilient to climate change. So how can we grow without compromising those things? So that's more of a question than it is like a dictum that you could take home with you, but that's maybe one thought to start the day. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Or like, you can just say you're wrong too. That's really, your hand went up really fast in the brown hat.
Held various cities and states to squeeze them as hard as they can and usually it's threatening to leave.
Yeah.
But in this case, you're talking about they promising to maybe come. But I have gotten the sense over the last 10 to 15 years that the public sentiment for that negotiation process has soured in terms of we want them no matter what, where they're more willing to say, screw you, go somewhere else. How do you think climate change kind of changes the calculus of that?
That's a really interesting question. I think eventually, so, one potential thought is that like climate change will probably create a scarcity of certain resource conditions for some industries, right? Like you can basically do like graphic design from anywhere, right? As has been proven like in 2020, since 2020, like in Maine. But if you're like operating a data center or something, you can only do that in a certain few places, right? And in a lot of cases, it's going to become very difficult, I think, like in a lot of places for certain industries to thrive in traditional areas. So that gives like a local government, I think, some amount of leverage. Now, of course, like if you're talking about between one Maine town and another, like that's a classic problem of like a race to the bottom, right? Where it's like, we'll give you, extensive subsidies to come here. And I think if anything, right, like that, the potential increase in private companies wanting to come here for one or another reason would maybe make that even a little bit more intense. But yeah, I mean, that's a really tough one, right? Like, and I don't know that climate change presents like a way out of that problem. It could make it more acute, but also, a lot of times these companies, like, they don't have a lot of choice in where they set up, or they, pay like a significant premium to be like farther away from the dam that they want to tap for hydropower or something. So there's maybe some kind of, for some communities, like some kind of leverage in that respect. Does that at all answer your question? It's kind of unanswerable, but in a good way.
One more question?
I was just reflecting on how migration has changed in terms of when we talk about smaller towns wanting people. I think when they say they want people, it's they want people to come and engage in the local economy, making local salaries, working in local jobs. But often I think this migration comes with people who are financially stable. They either have retirement funds that make them very comfortable, or they potentially have Manhattan salaries that they can take remotely, and they move to an area and they don't need the local economy to support themselves. And so you create this two-class system of people, as we call in Maine, from away, who come in who don't participate in the local economy in the way that people are reliant on locally. And that might talk about that strenuous social tension that comes with that migration in. I wonder what you might think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably in the near term is what you're more likely to see here than the other kind, where you get a company that, like really needs or wants to be here for climate reasons and is like willing to, and they'll bring workers who need to live close by and like don't have enough money to just like zip back and forth to Manhattan every weekend. I think like, because climate change has become such a salient social issue, you're probably likely to see a lot of people who are well off, frankly, like decide that they really want like, I mean, it's kind of like a more like slightly more like enlightened version of like the like bunker mentality, like a prepper. It's almost like, you people want to say, I don't want to be in New York City because it's like gets really hot in the summer now, and Hurricane Sandy made me really scared. So I'm gonna go up and like have like a little cottage in Maine and go into the store once a month, if at all, or like get Amazon to deliver me like my Bob's Red Mill, like, so I don't have to, so like, yeah, I think that's probably in the next 20, like that's what maybe a lot, and because a lot of communities here are like the incorporated communities are very small, like you'll probably notice it, right, if like even like 100 people do that. So like I think that's probably like the shorter term problem, and like that's a really fun one for like political reasons, figure out like how to address that, like how much do you want to try to extract from those people, or like how much do you want to put like a no vacancy sign up if they're not doing anything for you, like, and that's like a really probably going to create like a lot of, like, for a reporter, like a lot of like, you know, interesting stories of like tension, but it creates like a really intractable, like, it's mostly a problem of like social consensus more than it is like economic policy, I think. But I mean, yeah. Yeah, right. No, exactly. Like this is a huge problem, like everywhere really. But like in Idaho, it's extraordinary, like 400% price increases, and there's really no, like, I mean, already they weren't really doing anything, right? Like the state legislatures tend to move really slowly on this, and like local governments like have all these permitting delays for new affordable housing. Like we don't have like a policy infrastructure, I think, in most parts of the country that's equipped to deal with it. Like in Los Angeles, they've made a lot of really good progress in the last 3 years figuring this out, but it took like 50 years of like unbelievable affordability crisis to deal with it. Yeah, so it is, you're right that it is an economic policy question, but not one that seems to be like actively being solved in most, you know, small places. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, am I on? Corey, thanks. Thanks, Jake, for joining us this morning.